Hello everybody, thanks for joining me. It's great to see you here today. Today we are going to be making some cozy slipper boots. Now I made myself a pair of these about must be a good couple of years ago actually, and about 6 months ago after having worn them constantly for the whole of basically the lockdown. They gave up on me, unfortunately. So it's time to make a new pair. So I'm very excited to make a new pair today and to share that with you. So let's start off with what we need, or what I have prepared to make the slipper boots. So first of all, of course, you're going to need the Crafty Sew&So slipper boots pattern. Now this is available as a printed copy, or you can get the PDF download. And of course, if you download that, you can print it out and pretty much start making those today. And then, as well as the pattern, you're going to need a variety of different fabrics. Now, when thinking about fabrics for this, you're going to need something really, really nice and snuggly. And we really, really like sweatshirt jersey. So why we like this, or French terry, the reason that we like this is because it does have a bit of stretch and quite a bit of movement to it. And it's also really cozy and snuggly. And yeah, it just makes a really nice base for your slipper boots. I've also got some lining fabric. So I've gone for this really soft and cozy Sherpa fleece, which I think is beautiful. Just going to try lightening up a little bit and see if you guys can see a little bit better. And yes, it's so we've got the sweatshirt fabric, which is in this lovely black on pink dotty print. It's kind of a scribbly dot, so yeah, it makes it feel quite modern, which I really like. And then I've got some lovely Sherpa fleece for the inside, which is going to be really, really cozy. Now, the other thing you're going to need to do is to actually back your sweatshirt fabric, just to stop it from stretching out too much. Because basically, if you don't back your sweatshirt fabric, you're going to find that it kind of crumples around your ankles. And these are designed to be able to be turned over at the top. So you can do them with a turnover like that. But you can also wear them up, like, kind of pulled right up to your around your calves, if you want a really, really cozy, warm slipper boot. So yes, we have backed it with a woven cotton interfacing. You can use a non-woven, but I would use a medium weight. You don't want anything lightweight on this because it's just not going to have the stability that you're looking for. Okay. So you can make the soles of the slipper boots with your self fabric, so with this fabric, but I've chosen to use some grippy dot fabric. And this is a fabric that has kind of grippy dots on it. And yeah, it's basically just going to stop me sliding around on our laminate floors. So yeah, I think that's going to be really useful. I actually made a pair for my daughter using leather. So I was using the suede side of leather, and they worked really well because they were super strong and, of course, stopped her from, sliding all over the place, bless her. Especially, she's 2.5 now, but I think I made them for about a year ago. And, of course, she was just, walking, running, basically, but not actually being able to do it properly. So she definitely needed something with a bit of grip to it. So that was really good, using the suede side of leather for that. Yeah, and if you're interested in getting the grippy dot fabric, Dot to Dot Haberdashery on Etsy sell it, and that's where I got mine from. So do have a look there. So the other thing that you're going to need is some foam. So we use foam for the base of the slipper boots. inside the slipper boots. So this is Bosal in our form, and it's a single side fusible foam. So that means that one side of it is fusible. Now for each slipper boot, I've cut out 2 of these. So I've got 2, and then I've placed them with the adhesive side, which is the side that kind of has like a cross hatch kind of, it's basically more textured. There's one side that's kind of slightly textured and kind of shiny, and then there's one side that's kind of smooth and it looks more like felt. So the side that doesn't have the glue on is the side that looks like felt. The side that does have the glue on has kind of a crosshatch pattern on it. I have to remind myself of it every time, but I thought if I remind you now, then you can reference back to this whenever you need to. So basically I take one of my sole pieces and popping that on here so it's nice and easy to see. So I take one of my sole pieces, and then I take one of my inner sole foam pieces, and they are different pattern pieces. So just to out, you've got an outer sole pattern piece and you've got an inner sole pattern piece. The inner sole pattern piece is just about 1 centimetre smaller than the outer sole all the way around. And you're going to take, your outer sole with the wrong side facing up, and then your inner sole with the glue side facing down to that. And if you want to, you could press that to make the glue adhere at that point. But I actually just went for broke, laid on another piece again with the adhesive down so that it's adhering to the non-sticky side just here, and I placed it on like that. So I've got my 2 layers, aligned the layers, and then I took it to my ironing board and applied lots and lots of steam. So you don't need to apply loads of pressure to this, but you do need it on a hot setting, lots of steam. And if you're worried at all, as always, pop a pressing cloth over the top, and that will just protect your iron. It'll also protect everything else from burning. Now, one thing to mention, be really careful that you're not ironing on the glue side, because it will stick to your iron and then you'll ruin your iron, or you have to spend a long time cleaning it at the very least. The other thing to mention is don't iron the grippy dot side of your fabric, because again, that's made out of plastic. It's going to melt. So yeah, don't iron any other way other than the way that I've shown you. Okay, so here's one I have already adhered, and you can see that we've got the base, and then we've got one layer of foam and another layer of foam. So that is nice and firm, and it just gives a really nice base to your slippers. That's not going anywhere. We are also going to stitch all around to keep this in place and make sure that if we wash these, the foam sole doesn't come off. So the first pair that I made, I didn't, when we were developing the pattern, I didn't sew around, and the foamed inner sole just kind of floated around after a while because the glue became unstuck with wear and with washing. So that's why we recommend that you do sew all the way around. Now, because I've got grippy dot fabric, it's going to be a little tricky. It's going to get stuck a little bit in my machine. So when we come to that, I'll tell you how to get around that. There's a few little things that you can do just to make sure that you can still move the fabric around as much as possible. Okie dokie. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to take the top foot piece, which is this piece, and move those out of the way. And we're going to take the ankle piece, which is this piece, just here. So taking the ankle piece and we're going to place the little notch that you've created. So that's what the piece looks like. It looks a little bit like a top. So right in the center, you should have created a little notch, and we're going to place that over the top of the foot piece. So we just align the notch that's in the little V area of the foot piece and the notch that's in the center of the ankle piece. And pop a pin in. Okay. So you should now have something that looks a bit like that. And then we're going to take the end of our ankle piece and our foot piece and just pin those together. So you're just aligning that back seam basically. And then again, do the same at the other side. Okay, so now you can see you've got a kind of inverse curve and a curve that goes out. So you've got a curve that goes in like a smile and a curve that goes over like a frown. So you need to bring those two curves together. And the easiest way to do that is just kind of holding the fabric either end where you've got the pins. You just walk the fabrics together until you've got your raw edges aligned in the center, and pop a pin in there. Okay, and then we can do the same in between as well. And you'll find if you ever make, a top with sleeve set in, you'll use that same technique. So that's why it's great to make simple craft projects or small accessories projects if you are thinking about getting into bigger projects, bigger dressmaking projects, because you'll learn a lot from the techniques that you do on smaller projects, but there's not quite so much to worry about. So you can just kind of relax into the project a bit and allow yourself to learn and to experiment with those techniques on a craft project. I think it's very easy to get a bit overwhelmed if you choose quite a complicated dressmaking project straight after you've learned to sew. It can be very, very tempting, but it's definitely we have a phrase, start as you mean to sew on, and we want you to basically build a foundation of skills so that when you want to come to make that more complicated project, you've got all those skills in place. So that's what all of our kits and patterns are aimed to do. Just build you with that real kind of arsenal of skills that you'll be able to apply to any project in the future. So I have applied the foot panel to the ankle panel, as you can see here. And now all that's left to do is to sew those together. So, just pop some thread on. I'm going to use white thread today so that you can see my stitches. I don't think there's going to be a lot to see. It's very basic. But just in case there is anything, I thought it would be worth using a slight contrast so that you can see what's going on. Okay. So because I am sewing with stretch fabric, I have popped a ballpoint needle in my machine. To be honest, at the moment, there's always a ballpoint needle in our machines because we're just sewing jersey, jersey, jersey. Yeah, so, but it's always working because even if it is your machine, you might not remember what you've put in. It's a good idea to put a post-it note, to be honest, just saying what needle you've currently got in your machine. That can be quite handy. Remove the foot pedal. Okay. So the seam allowance on this project is 1 centimetre, and that's written on all of the pattern pieces just to remind you as you go. So because I've applied the woven interfacing, I'm actually just going to sew with a normal straight stitch. So normally when you sew a stretch fabric, you would sew with a stretch stitch because you want to be able to allow the stitches to stretch as the fabric does. But we've stopped the stretch of the woven interfacing. So I could just go ahead and sew with a normal straight stitch. One thing I am going to do is ever so slightly elongate it. So my normal stitch length is 2.5 and I'm actually just going to elongate it to 3 just to give myself a little bit more welly to get along the seam because it is a little bit of a thicker fabric. So that's just going to help a bit. Okay, so I'm going to start off with a little tiny bit of back stitching. That first pin out of the way. On my magnetic pin. We've just got some new ones in actually. They're heart shaped and very pretty. And I actually don't have a magnetic pin cushion at home, so I think I might need to be purchasing myself one. Maybe that'll be my Mother's Day treat to myself. Okey-dokey, so I'm basically following the edge of the fabric, and then when I get to that notch in the middle, a little V, I'm just going to stitch in, lift up the, leave my needle in, lift up the foot, and just pivot round. You really do want as neat a V as possible. I've just noticed that I'm 1 stitch too short, so I'm just going to go ahead and do 1 more stitch. And that really will make all the difference because it will keep my seam allowances consistent and it's just going to keep everything looking really, really nice and neat. Just there. Okay. And then when I get to the end, a bit of back stitching. Always have in your mind, if you want the seam that you've sewn to stay together, do a bit of back stitching. Simple rule. Okay, so I've applied my foot panel to my ankle panel, and just in the middle here where I've got my notch already, I'm just going to take my scissors and snip into that seam allowance down to the V. Just show you a bit closer up what that looks like. So that's what we've done, just snipped down to about a couple of millimetres away from the sewn seam there. And that'll just release everything and get everything sitting all nice and neat. Okay, and we can see almost straight away, these are starting to take the shape of a slipper boot, which is very exciting. And I love a project like that. I do kind of love the ones where it's a bit of a surprise. So our zip makeup bag is definitely a surprise up until the last minute. And most of our learners say, I don't know how that's going to work. And we just say, trust us, it will. But then it's so nice sometimes, especially when you're sewing at home, to have a project where it actually looks like the thing that you're making quite soon. It's quite reassuring, really. Okay, so next I'm going to take my panels and I'm just going to join the back seam. So the one thing I want to be careful of here is I'm just going to match my seam where my ankle and my foot panel meet. And I'm going to fold out my seam allowances like so, just to reduce the bulk. Otherwise it can get pretty bulky at that point because of course you've got your 4 layers of fabric if you include your seam allowances, and then you've also of course got your interfacing. So that does make a bit of a difference to the bulk that you'll be sewing. Okie dokie. So I'm just going to put a few more pins in here. Not loads, but you know, just a few to stop things from wiggling around. I can concentrate on talking to you guys, not on taming my fabric, because that's all pins are there for really, is just to make sure that things don't move around whilst you're not seeing them. underneath the machine, or as they come up to being underneath the machine. Okay, so I've just put a few pins along there, and just here on the seam allowance, I've put a pin just holding the seam allowance down, and that's holding the back as well, because I'm going to sew from the top all the way down. And what could happen as I sew up to here, or even if I held this side of the seam allowance down, I could end up with the back flipping over. So if I just put an extra pin in, it just reminds me to be super aware, to check the underneath, and it will just help keep it in place whilst I'm sewing. So I'm going to make sure I'm sewing a 1 centimetre seam allowance again. Start with a back stitch. That back stitch in, and then I'm going to sew all the way down this back seam. Just checking ever so often that everything is still aligned. That seam allowance there, so just making sure that the underneath is still. So I'm going to sew almost up to the pin before taking it out. Is taking the pins out too early. You don't have to take the pins out until your needle is almost on top of them. Do try to take them out before you sew on them. It's not the end of the world if you sew over a pin, but it could break your needle, or at the very least it could just make it a little bit less sharp. So it's always a good idea to try and take out the pins, but don't take them out too soon, because they're there for a reason. They're holding everything in place, and they're meaning that you don't have to concentrate on holding everything yourself, because the pins are doing the work for you. So at the end, I've just done some back stitching again, and it really is starting to look like a slipper boot now, which is really exciting. So the next thing that we're going to do is, by hand, I'm just going to fold open the seam allowance at the back. Now you could do that, you could take that to the iron and do that, but it really doesn't make a big difference, because the fabric just doesn't press that brilliantly when it's a thicker fabric. So just a bit of finger pressing is enough, really. So I'm now going to apply my slipper boot bottom, so my base. So I want to have my outer against the outside of the fabric, and I'm looking for those little notches that I've made in the end. So if you haven't made those notches, grab your pattern piece and just mark them on. There's one at the toe and there's one at the heel, and that's what you need to make sure that you are matching up with the right places. So I'm just matching my back seam with the back of the sole. I've forgotten a very important part, which I said that I didn't do the first time round and nearly didn't do again this time. We need to sew to make sure that this stays in place, so that the foam stays attached to the outer. So I'm just going to switch over my machine to black thread. I'm going to put black thread in the bobbin, because I'm going to be sewing on the foam side of this. So because I'm using this grippy dot fabric, if I put it underneath my machine, the dots are going to get stuck underneath the foot. So I really need to make sure, oh, it's snowing. I really need to make sure that I'm putting the fabric that way down. It's still going to get stuck on the surface here, but I've just got a bit more control over it, and yeah, I should be able to get it to go through quite nicely. So again, because I'm working with thick, very thick layers this time, of 2 layers of foam and 1 of outer, I'm actually going to increase my stitch length to 4.5. I'm going to go for 4.5, because this really is just a stitch to kind of hold. It's an extra to hold things together. So I'm going to line up the edge of my foot with the edge of the foam. and I'm just going to stitch all the way around, trying to keep things as neat as possible, because of course this stitching is going to be seen on the outside of the fabric. So let's give this a go. The other thing that I should say I've done is I've reduced the presser foot pressure as well. So I've just made that a little bit less grippy. So I've got a bit more movement of my fabric. Okay. And that's taking everything through nice and easily. So when I get to the back, I really want to make sure I'm getting a nice smooth curve. So I'm just going to lift and ever so slightly turn when I'm getting to that really sharp curve there. I say corner, but it's definitely not a corner. And then just a few stitches at a time, lift and turn. A few stitches, lift and turn. It makes a nice squeaky sound, doesn't it, really? With the dot. Right. Sorry about the slightly unpleasant sound, but it's working well. And of course, because you've got the foam already adhered to the base, it does make it a lot easier to do this bit, really. Just make sure that everything stays where it needs to. I actually quite enjoy doing this bit because it is quite kind of almost, it's not freehand, but it's quite, you just have to let the machine go where it goes. And if you end up with a few wobbles, don't worry. It's a great idea to make sure that you're using a similar coloured thread to the base fabric. So yeah, that's looking all very beautiful. Just stitching over the stitches that I've already created, just about 2 or 3 centimetres to make sure that I've definitely got a really good grip there. And put up that thread, snip that one off. So that is how everything's looking. I'm just going to snip the extra thread that's on the bottom. Yeah, that's definitely going nowhere. That is going to be a really, really solid sole to my slipper boot. So I'm really, really happy with how that is working out. Yeah, and if you want to get some of the grippy dot fabric, remember that you can get it from Dot to Dot Haberdashery on Etsy. It's been very helpful to me. So, okay, so now we can go ahead and we can match that back notch on the base of the foot of the sole with the back seam on the main boot. And again, I'm just going to put some pins either side of these seam allowances to make sure that they stay in place. Okay. And then I'm going to flip it round and I'm just going to match the notch at the front of the outer boot with the notch on the sole as well. I do love notches. They just tell you so much information. Just make it really, really easy to make sure that you've got the right bits joined up to the right bits and never ever miss them out. Okay, so now I've got my front and my back attached and I just need to carry on pinning around. Just trying to ease the fabric around so that I don't end up with too many puckers or anything like that. And as I'm pinning, I'm just trying to catch like a really small amount of fabric. So I'm going to use quite a few pins around the back because that area is quite a tight curve, as we discussed. But I'm just putting pins in a tiny little bit. So hopefully you can see that there quite clearly. You can see I've just caught a tiny bit of the outer fabric to the sole. And that is really, really important. On our My Handmade Wardrobe blog, we've got a whole article about pinning. I'm a bit obsessed with pinning, but it does make such a difference. So if you want to have a bit of a read about how best to pin various different shapes to each other, go and have a read. Right, just carry on with this. So on the straight edges, you don't need as many pins, and actually right at the front, you really don't need as many either. It's just around that back heel that you really want to go for it with the pins. So save your pins for that area. Having said that, you do want to have plenty here, because when you come to stitch this, you are going to need to stitch with thick foam of the sole, of the insole, actually underneath your machine foot. So the more pins you have, the better, really. You might find you have to do a little bit of easing to get the fabrics to sit well together, but they will eventually. Okay, looking good. Now it's very, very easy to get puckers in the back of the slipper. I've done it before when making them. You can kind of ease the fabrics out if you're very, very careful, but if you get a little pucker on your first one, don't worry. It's only a tiny, tiny little bit of a puckered fabric, and it is a tricky, tricky bit to get completely flat. So you can see here, I've got a bit of excess fabric, and whilst I'm stitching, there's a chance that that might move. So that's why I've put so many pins in. And I've put them in this way, just holding a tiny bit of the fabric down. The other thing that I should probably show you that I've done is just put all of the pin heads into the pin ends into the foam, just to make sure that you're not going to catch yourself on anything with this one that's sticking out. Yeah, because when you're using lots and lots of pins, there is a chance that you might just catch yourself, and it's not a pleasant thing. It's not the end of the world, you know. Still happens to me all the time. But the more you do, the more practice you get, the more you learn to avoid pinning and ending up having to leave the project halfway through to go get plaster, which is basically the worst part of it. Okay, so nearly there with the pins. You do need quite a few pins for this. I'm also trying to use my nice long thin pins because they go through jersey fabric a lot easier. I've got some lovely heart-shaped pins here, but they don't really go through very well. Okie dokie, so that's what we're looking like a bit of a pin cushion, but that's how many pins you're going to need. You do need to really go to town with your pinning on the back there. Okay, I'm just checking that we've got enough on that back section. I think I have. Okay, so when you're sewing this, the easiest way to get a really neat and consistent stitch line is basically to put the fabric, so move your needle into the center of the machine. So I'm just going to do that now. So for me, my machine goes from 0 to 7 millimeters. That's the total width, possible width of my stitch. And so the middle for me is 3.5. So probably will be similar for you. And then I'm going to position my foot and needle so that the middle of the foot runs along the edge of the foam. And that's the reason that I've moved my needle over, because I want a decent amount of the foot to be on the foam. What you could do alternatively is you could actually move your needle all the way over to the right, and then you've got the majority of your foot on the foam. Basically what's happening now is it's going to be stitching at a slight angle, a slight kind of sideways hill, and that can be a bit difficult when you're first starting out. So if you do a few stitches and you find that quite difficult, move your needle right the way over, but just be aware you want to be creating your stitches on the edge or just shy of the edge of the foam. You want to kind of not be stitching the foam, but you want to be just going around the foam, the outline of it. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start stitching. All the time I'm going to be really, really mindful and careful about what's going on underneath, because that's where everything is happening that I can't see. So I'm also just going to change my stitch length back down to 3, just because I want it to be a really strong stitch. And I'm just going to go ahead. Okay, so as I'm coming up to this top corner, and you'll notice I started at the bottom and went towards the toe, because the toe is the easiest bit compared to the heel. So start with the easy bit, give yourself a run up, get used to sewing a larger curve before you then go on to sewing your very tight curve at the heel. Let's make life easy for us. That's one of the key things about being a beginner sewer, is giving yourself a chance to learn in a way that makes sense. So when you're working on a project, there's quite often for our beginners classes, we choose projects that skill you up with something that, with skills that you're going to need for your next project. So on our day class, we'll start off by making a small needle case, and that then gives you the skills that you need to make the tote bag in the afternoon. And we usually find that people don't have any problems, don't make any mistakes really on the tote bag in the afternoon, because they have learnt the essential skills by making something small that doesn't really matter too much. They can make the mistakes on that small project, and then when it comes to the big project, the thing that you're actually going to be using, on a daily basis, taking out and showing off and having people saying, "Oh, that's nice," and saying, "I made it," and with pride. Yeah, you want to make sure that there's as few mistakes on that as possible. I mean, obviously, mistakes are reminders that we all are on a learning path. But yeah, it's good to give yourself a good starting off point by taking on some smaller projects first. Something that we're looking at the moment is actually packaging up some of our beginners' smaller classes as recorded courses. And yeah, if that's something that you're interested in, then if you are a very new sewer, yeah, keep an eye out, and we'll have something coming out to you very soon. It's quite an exciting project to work on. Right, so as I get to the back, I am just making sure that I've got as few puckers as possible. And how I'm doing that is I'm just kind of keeping an eye out on the underneath the fabric, feeling what it feels like. If it feels a bit chunky, it just felt a little bit chunky there, so there might be a little tiny pucker there. Yeah, if it feels chunky, there's probably something not quite right going on underneath. But don't worry too much, just keep going unless it feels really, really thick. Yeah, and we can have a look afterwards and see whether we need to unpick a few stitches and restitch, or whether we can get away with it, which 9 times out of 10 we can. So I've come back round on myself. I have stitched over my stitches about 2 or 3 centimetres, so it's got a nice firm join. And oh, so this was the pucker that I was worried about. So tiny, tiny little pucker, and actually, if I use my nails, that's going to come out almost completely. And that's the beauty of the jersey fabric, is that actually that is going to virtually disappear to nothing. So the next thing that I want to do is to turn the slipper boot the right way out and have a look at it. Now, you can trim your seam allowances all around here if you want to, but because I've used a woven fabric for my sole, and I can see that it's fraying already, I don't really want to cut away any of that. I could choose to trim away some of my sweatshirt fabric, but it's not that thick. So I think I'm actually going to choose to not trim around. In the instructions, it will tell you to trim, but you kind of have to use your intuition when it comes to using different fabrics. And if it feels like it's going to fray, or it just needs the extra strength of a bit of extra seam left in, then leave it in by all means. It's not going to do any harm. Okay, so there we have our slipper boot, and it's got a lovely solid sole. Feels really like substantial. It feels proper. Feels like something that you might have actually bought from a nice shop. So yeah, I've just got a tiny, tiny little pucker back right at the back. I'm not going to worry about that. I'm going to let myself have that one. And everything else is looking really nice and smooth. Okay. So the next thing that we're going to do, I'm going to switch over my bobbin again to white threads, because I'm going to be sewing my fleecy fabric. Check that that's all in okay. Right, so we're just basically going to do exactly what we did before, piecing all the pieces together. So starting off with the foot panel. The only thing we have here, of course, is that we don't have any notches, because you can't really notch this fabric. I could have put some markings on with a pen or something like that, but you can't obviously notch this fabric because it's so fluffy at the edges. You'd use any notches. So I'm going to just basically use my memory of where things should go. I would recommend for you, get a pen, just pop a couple of marks on it. It doesn't even need to be a fabric pen, because everything's going to be inside and hidden. We really like friction pens for marking fabrics when the marks might be seen on the outside, but for this you could just get a Sharpie pen or something along those lines, felt tip, that kind of thing. Right, and again, because this fabric is very wibbly wobbly, cut yourself some slack when it comes to lining up the edges perfectly. It's one of those things that it's not going to show if everything isn't lined up perfectly, but equally it is quite easy to not have everything aligning, and then you end up with little holes and things like that. So just be aware of where things are matching up, but don't lose sleep over it. Don't use 50,000 pins for this bit. It's not going to be worth it. And we've got a decent seam allowance here of 1 centimetre, so that is going to give you a little bit of leeway, a little bit of wiggle room. Okay, so I'm just going to sew that again with my 1 centimetre seam allowance. I need to remember that I changed my needle position, so I'm just going to change that back, and I'm actually going to extend my stitch on this to 4. I'm not going to use a stretch stitch again, because I know on this thick fabric, the stretch stitch quite often gets stuck. So yeah, again, I'm just going to use a straight stitch, and it's not going to have that much stretch to it because the outside fabric is holding everything all in place. So I don't need to do much about that. Okay, now it is pretty tricky to see your edges when you're working with a thick fluffy fabric. Just let me extend quite a bit more. Now, often if you find that you're working with thick fabric and it's not going through the machine, just try extending your stitch length. Don't try and jam it through, or pull it, or anything like that. You will end up with things going a bit awry. But it's a good idea. So just lengthen that stitch length a bit, and that will make all the difference. Often it's a small adjustment that actually makes a big difference. Okay, look at my centre again. I'm doing the same. I am lifting, I am turning, pivoting at that point. Again, just checking out what's going on underneath. A whole lot of fluff is what's going on underneath. Getting to the end, so it's a little bit of back stitching, but not worrying about it too much, because yeah, you will find that if you try and back stitch on this fabric, it just ends up going all caught up because it's like, I don't know where to go, got too much fluff in the way. And then again, I'm going to do what I did with the outer, and I'm going to snip into the centre just to release that. Just check out. It's something that looks a little tiny bit puckered, but actually when you look at the outside of the fleecy fabric, it just you can't see it at all. So really nothing to worry about. And then I'm going to join the back. Again, matching that back seam. I'm going to try my best to match the seam and to open out those seam allowances. Again, you can't see it because it's so darn fluffy, so it's really not something to worry about too much. Pin in the back there. Trying to use these big pins because the fabric is so fluffy. I don't want to lose them as I'm sewing. And that's why it's good to have pins that have got nice bright tops to them as well. Don't lose them in your fabric as easily. Right, so sewing the back seam the same as we did. That was struggling a little bit. You will find that if you sew too close to the edge, it will struggle to go through the machine. So always start a little bit further in when you're sewing thick fabric, right on the edge of the fabric. Same goes for jerseys as well, and lightweight jerseys. Basically anything a bit unusual, start a little bit further in. I'm going over that thick seam now, so I'm just paying a bit more attention to making sure that the machine is still going through. And you can sew these on any machine. It doesn't have to be a really high-powered machine. All you need to make sure is that you've got that ballpoint needle in, and it should be absolutely fine. All right, just going to check my seams, make sure that they're nice and strong. Okay. Okay, so one thing I've forgotten to tell you to do, which is very important to turn the slipper boot the right way out, you need to leave a gap in the back of your stitching. So stitch the top part about halfway down, leave a gap, and then start stitching again. So I'm just going to go over that again, just to seal off those stitching, because I don't want those coming apart. And then what you would do is, once you've joined everything together, you will hand stitch that gap closed. That's the final thing to do whilst you're sitting on the sofa, all snuggled up, cup of hot chocolate, thinking, oh, I could really do with a pair of finished slipper boots to complete this experience. Just hand sew that seam closed, and then very soon you will have. So I've got a little gap. It's about 4 fingers wide. Don't need any more really for that. Okay, and now I need to put the sole on. So I've got my sole here. Again, we haven't put notches in because they would get a bit lost. So instead of that, I'm just going to use some pins basically to transfer the markings from the pattern. It's basically halfway along anyway, so you can just do it by eye, but if you use the pattern, it's obviously a little more accurate and saves you any guesswork. And then with the base of the slipper, with the foot, I'm just going to fold it in half and find that centre point. Okay, and that's where I'm going to start stitching. Okey-dokey. Now again, this fabric is going to be pretty forgiving when it comes to easing your curves. So don't worry too much about that. We're not having to put in loads and loads of pins at the back like we did with the outer. Everything's going to be on the inside as well, and it's all very fluffy, so you won't see it. Should say you can also do this, of course, with any type of warm, cozy fabric. So you could use the wrong side of sweatshirt fabric, or you could use self fabric. You could use sweatshirt on the outside and the inside of these slippers, and you can use any type of fleece as well, micro fleece. You can also use fur as well. I was going to use fur today. But I had this alpine fleece already Sherpa fleece already to hand, so I decided to go with that. But I do fancy a pair with some of the lovely navy or grey fleece that we've actually got in stock as a lining. Yes, I'm just being careful as I go around this, just to make sure that I'm not stretching my fabric too much, because the curve of the top of the foot, the curved edge, there's a chance of stretching that. It's not too easy to stretch it, but just something to be aware of. I like to point out what to be aware of. Nearly there. Yeah, the top of the slipper boot is, the foot is kind of rolling quite a bit, so I'm kind of battling that ever so slightly. Actually, once you tell it what to do, kind of listens to you. A bit like my toddler. She kind of listens to me. Just say we get there in the end with all of these things. So I'm going to start sewing again at one of the sides. This time I'm not being too worried about whether I'm going around the toe or the heel first. The fabric is, again, more forgiving. Okay, and I'm just going to stitch around like before, just making sure that I keep checking underneath that those layers are still lined, because it's very easy to let that top foot part, the seam allowances, just roll away from you. And then you can just end up with a really, really narrow seam allowance, or, you know, a hole basically where you have your seam allowance in. And tight back corner, edge. Now, obviously, when you're working with thicker, fluffy fabric, just be really aware of where your fingers are. It's quite easy in a bid to push the thicker, fluffy fabric underneath to get your finger in the way. Although these machines are wonderful safety devices that they just cut off if your finger goes really near. But yeah, it's always worth a look out. Again, just something to be aware of. So many things to be aware of. But when you are aware of them, you kind of just take it all and relax into it and enjoy it. Sometimes it's the not knowing what I should be worrying about feeling that can be more disconcerting. But she's a bit good. So if you're at all nervous about using this kind of fabric, it's a great idea to make things like little heat pads to go in your, just checking that the stitches have created properly, little warmable heat pads to go in your coat pockets for winter. Fill them with wheat and then warm them up in the microwave, and then keep your hands nice and cosy. So that's a good way to get used to sewing with thicker fabrics. I'm just basically using smaller projects to build up your confidence whenever you're working with new fabric. So if you really, really want to make a beautiful silk dress, then make yourself something smaller with that beautiful fabric or a similar beautiful fabric first, or make the same thing in a cheaper fabric first to get you kind of feeling for it. Okay, so we've got our lining. So now I'm going to put my outer boot inside my lining. Easier said than done, actually, with the grippy sole. Well, I think I might do it the other way, actually. Turn my slipper boot the wrong way out, and then I'll turn my lining the right way out. Get a little trickier now that you've got the foam on, but it's working fine. Move that out the way so you can see. And turn my lining the right way out. That's so soft. Okay, and I'm going to put my lining inside. Just give that a good shake down. And then I'm going to match my back seam couple of pins in that just to make sure that that stays absolutely flat and open. And then at the front, just going to do the same. Now obviously my front fabric, my outer fabric has got the interfacing on and my inner fabric hasn't. So my lining fabric has got a bit of stretch to it. So I just want to use plenty of pins just to really control that as much as possible. Make sure I don't end up with anything kind of moving too much as I'm stitching around. Okay, we're nearly there. Okay, so we've got it all pinned all the way around, and we're just going to take off the free arm so that we can put the slipper boot over there. And this is going to be nice and easy to sew now. So I'm sewing with the woven fabric on top. I'm taking a generous 1 centimetre seam allowance because, of course, here it doesn't matter too much if your seam allowance is a little bit more. And it's a good idea to have a little bit extra because you don't want any holes or anything moving around too much. Again, that's the great thing about crafts and accessories, is that the seam allowances aren't as important. Pedals running away from me. And I'm coming back around on my stitching, and I'm just going to stitch over again, as always, about 2 or 3 centimetres of stitching that I've already created, cutting it off. Okay, so now let's have our machine stitching done. So we have an interesting shape. If anybody's ever made a Christmas stocking, this will look quite familiar to you. Interesting shape with kind of 2 ends. We need to take that opening that we had in the back and we need to pull everything through there. And that's why we reinforced that stitching, that opening. So we just did a little bit of back stitching at either end of that opening just to make sure it definitely didn't pull or rip when I'm doing this. We don't want to do all that lovely hard work beautifully and find that our stitches pop. You do have to give this a little bit of welly, but also be gentle with it. It's a bit of a contrast of terms there. Okay, so once you've got your sole out, everything else is a lot easier. So we've got our sole out. And then, pull the lining out. Okay, and then we just simply poke our lining down into our boot. A little wiggle. It's so cozy. Right. Just checking out what's going on outside, whether it's still snowing. It's not beautiful blue skies now, so less need for cosy slipper boots, but still. And there we go. There we have our lovely cosy slipper boot. And of course you can fold the top down or you can leave it up if you want. And all you need to do now is to make the second one. So I hope you've enjoyed sewing along with me and making a slipper boot today. The pattern that we use is our own slipper boot pattern, which, as I said, is available in a paper version or a PDF version. The paper version is £10 and the PDF version is £6. And yeah, all the information that you need is on our website, craftysew&so.com, and you can buy it from there. You can also buy it from our Etsy store as well. So yes, I hope you've enjoyed this sew along today, and do get this pattern, make yourself a pair of cosy slipper boots and enjoy. Happy sewing. Bye. You made a slipper? I did. Excellent. Made a slipper.